Good evening and welcome to First Baptist Church Azle Wednesday night Bible study. We're so glad to have you, and we're so glad to have those at home watching online. We have several times throughout the Bible where there's a dove, where John baptized Jesus and they ascended like a dove, and anyway, Noah, and so I thought we'd try that. Maybe we can all stand so we can praise God together. On the wings of a snow white dove, he sends his pure, sweet love, a sign from above. On the wings of a dove, when troubles surround us and the evil comes, the body grows weak, the spirit grows numb. When these things beset us, he doesn't forget us. He sends out his love on the wings of a dove, on the wings of a snow white dove. He sends his pure, sweet love, a sign from above. On the wings of a dove, when Noah had drifted on the flood many days, he searched for land in various ways. Trouble he had some, but he wasn't forgotten. He sent him his on the wings of a dove, on the wings of a snow white dove. He sends his pure, sweet love, a sign from above. On the wings of a dove, a sign from above. On the wings of a dove. Well, I could kind of hear you. That's a good thing. I was thinking today, actually I was thinking about this the other day. My memory doesn't really go, in spurts of days. I remember way back when we got through that first 3 months with the COVID, and we've been locked in for 3 months, and they finally said, okay, you can try meeting with groups of 10 people without issues. I don't know 10 people without issues. I'm going to try this, keeps me singing the reason we are singing. There's within my heart a melody, Jesus whispers sweet and low. Fear not, I am with thee, peace be still, in our love's life ebb and flow. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my ever longing, keeps me singing as I go. All my life was wrecked by sin and strife, discord filled my heart with pain. Jesus wept across the broken strings, stirred the slumbering chords again. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my ever longing, keeps me singing as I go. Feasting on the riches of his grace, resting neath his sheltering wing, always looking on his smiling face, that is why I shout and sing. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my ever longing, keeps me singing as I go. Soon he's coming back to welcome me, far beyond the starry sky. I shall win my fights to worlds unknown, I shall ring with him on high. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my ever longing, Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my longing, keeps me singing as I go. Thank you. You can be seated.
Amen. Thank you very much, Miss Ann. Appreciate that. I'm glad that you're here tonight. Open your Bibles to the book of Judges. We're in chapter 3 and 4 tonight, Judges chapter 3 and 4. It's a good night to be here if you're watching online, if you're here in person, because this is where we get into the judges, those individuals chosen by God to serve as judges and champions of Israel. When I was growing up, I found it odd. I didn't quite get the connection between the champions of Israel, these people with unusual feats of strength and ability, like Samson, etc., and those through whom God did miracles. And we're going to see that tonight. And like with Gideon, for example, we're not going to see him yet. But and yet these people were called not superheroes; they were called judges. And there's a reason for that, a very pragmatic reason. And we'll see that tonight. But we looked at the introduction to the book last week, chapters 1 and 2, as it began to set up the pattern for us, or the theme of the book, that is repetitious for every judge. The Israelites sin. They follow after other gods. God gives them over into the oppressive hands of the enemy. They cry out to God and for help. God hears their cries after a certain period of time, and he delivers them by using a judge. And then after that happens, then they eventually go back to their sin, and the cycle begins all again. And so that brings us, though, to our very first judges that we're going to see in chapters 3 and 4 tonight. We're going to look at several. Some in the book of Judges, it gives a great deal of information, but for some of the judges, it's just a sentence or two long. And so we'll see both of that tonight. Judges chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. The 5 rulers of the Philistines, all of the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites living in the Lebanon mountains from Mount Baal, Hermon to Lebo Hamath. They were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands, which he had given their forefathers through Moses. So here it does give us an interesting indication as to why God allowed these people to continue to exist. He's using them. First of all, it says he's going to use the Canaanites that are there to test the Israelites in battle. So those in battle who have not been battle tested, they can learn how to fight. And then secondly, he's testing them on moral grounds as to whether or not they're going to be faithful to him. The tribe of Judah was not able to hold on to the key Philistine cities they had taken, as we saw in chapter 1. The other tribes failed to conquer the Canaanite nations, and these surviving nations adopted a good neighbor policy toward Israel that eventually defeated Israel from within. Sometimes Satan comes as a lion to devour, but often he comes as a serpent to deceive, and that's what these nations ultimately begin to do. As typical in the Old Testament, by the way, my commentary materials from the Bible Exposition Commentary on the Old Testament. Now, verse 5. Here we see the pattern begin. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served other gods. They did 2 things here, and they were supposed to do neither. In fact, these are the 2 things that are expressly forbidden. Don't intermarry with them, and don't follow after their gods. They did both. Unlike Moses, who appointed Joshua to lead Israel, the judges didn't have the authority to name a successor. When God called men and women to serve as judges, they obeyed, and we're going to see that tonight. They did his work, and then they passed from the scene. One would hope that their godly influence would make a lasting difference in the spiritual life of the nation. But such was not the case. Unfortunately, time and time again, they did not learn. No sooner was a judge off the scene than the people were back to worshiping Baal and forsaking God. So look with me in verse 7. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Asherahs. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of the Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. All right, that's a long name. And so it says in verse 7 that they forgot the Lord their God. Now, it's not saying that they have amnesia or time has passed and they got absent-minded. When it says they forgot God, it means that they simply dismissed him. And as a result, they were subject under these foreign people for 8 years. When Israel obeyed God, he blessed them. And both their conduct and God's blessings were a testimony for their unbelieving neighbors. God's plan was to share with the world that he's a good God when his people are faithful to him. Unfortunately, he couldn't get the people to go along with that, the Israelites, and instead it just happened to be the opposite. The pagan people were supposed to say, these Jews are different. The God they worship is a great God. And the Jewish people would then have opportunities to tell their neighbors how to trust in God and receive his forgiveness and blessing. But instead of trusting God to change their neighbors, the gods of their neighbors changed the Jews. And everything Moses warned them not to do, they did. Verse 9. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. We saw the name of Othniel mentioned last week, and so here we see him as the nation's first judge. Verse 10, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. That's it. That's all we know about this guy, Othniel. He was a judge. He served as a judge, and he became a champion when he went to war against their enemy. So if you see the pattern, they were subject to this enemy for 8 years this time. And then Othniel stepped in, so they had peace for how long? Yeah, so they cried out for 8 years, they were delivered, and they had peace for 40 years. Now the pattern is, as soon as God's champion dies, that's the end of the faithfulness, really, with God's people. Othniel not only rescued his nation from bondage, but also served his people as a judge. And when I say judge, or when they say judge, literally they mean a judge, and we'll see that again in just a minute, by a female judge we'll read about. This meant that the judge exercised authority in managing the affairs of the nation, and it was his or her spiritual and civil leadership that brought rest to the land. Never underestimate the good that one person can do who is filled with the Spirit of God and obedient to the will of God. In fact, we're going to see time again in the book of Judges how one person makes a difference. No slur against committees, God bless them, but God never rose up a committee or a group of senators or congressmen to be his judges. It was one person. This time it was Othniel. Verse 12, once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Elgon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him, I said Elgon, it's Eglon, came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. Again, what is the city of palms? Jericho. That's right. We talked about that last week. Verse 14, the Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for how long? 18 years. There's a little consistency there. The armies of Mesopotamia came a long distance to invade Israel, but the Moabites, Ammonites, and Amalekites were not only neighbors, but also relatives of the Jews. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, do you remember Lot? Was the ancestor of Moab and Ammon. We see that in Genesis chapter 19. And Esau, the brother of Jacob, was the ancestor of Amalek. We see that in Genesis chapter 6 and in Deuteronomy 25. Now this guy, Eglon, what an interesting name, Eglon, the king of Moab, organized the confederacy and set up his headquarters at Jericho. And Jericho was under a curse. We found that out in Joshua chapter 6, verse 26. And there's no evidence that the city had been rebuilt, but the location was ideal for directing military operations, and there was an abundance of water there. For 18 years, Eglon and his allies made life miserable for the Jews, and it must have been especially galling to them to be under the heels of blood relatives who were also their longtime adversaries. All right, verse 15. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud. Do you remember Ehud? Okay, I didn't write this story. I'm just going to read it, but it is a fascinating story. We don't remember Ehud, but we have a pretty lengthy story about him here. He's a fascinating fellow. He was, up until this last generation, when we found out it was not true or accurate, he was considered handicapped. Because of why? He was left-handed. Now, we don't see that as a bad thing. One or two of my kids are left-handed. And, I've known many left-handed people. We don't make much of it anymore. But even when I was a kid back in the 60s, they were still trying to convince left-handed children to become right-handed because you didn't want a left-handed child. Is that not odd? Well, that was considered a handicap 3,000 years ago, so he was a left-handed man. He was the son of Gera the Benjamite. The Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about 1.5 feet long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. Now that's important because most people were right-handed, so where did they put their sword? They put it on the left. When you go to grab it, you go from right to left. And so he had this hidden under his skirt, or whatever they called it back then. They didn't call it a skirt, but his robe, where they couldn't see it. Verse 17, he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way the men who had carried it. At the idols near Gilgal, he himself turned back and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. The king said, quiet, and all of his attendants left him. Ehud then approached the king while he was sitting along in the upper room of his summer palace and said, I have a message from God for you. As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, which came out his back. Now, again, I'm fascinated the Bible decides to give us these kind of details, but they did. Ehud did not pull out the sword, and the fat closed in over it. Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said, he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the house. He went to the bathroom. They waited to the point of embarrassment, but when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their Lord fallen to the floor dead. Now, isn't it interesting, out of all of those details, that you notice that they had locks and keys even back then? I find that interesting. Verse 26, while they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the idols and escaped to Serah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. Follow me, he ordered, for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands. So they followed him down, and taking possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab, they allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong, not a man escaped. That day, Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. There is somebody famous from Moab. Ruth was from Moab. And why is Ruth famous? Yes, she was a good grandmother too. She was the grandmother of, you're getting close. She was the grandmother, I believe the grandmother of David. And so she's in the genealogy of Jesus. But here, Moab doesn't know that yet. That's not their claim of fame here. It's something much worse, or a lot worse. Ehud had several problems to solve, and he solved them successfully. At the top of the list was how to gain access to King Eglon without making anybody suspicious. He accomplished this by making himself the leader of the commission that brought the king his annual tribute. The paying of tribute not only added to the king's wealth, which he would enjoy, but it also acknowledged the king's authority over Israel. And Eglon would enjoy that as well. Of course, Eglon didn't know that Ehud was God's appointed leader to deliver Israel. Otherwise, he would have killed him on sight. The second problem was securing a private audience with the king without exciting the distrust of his attendants and guards. Ehud did this first by leaving the king's presence together after they had done homage to Eglon. And then Ehud came back alone, as though he had an urgent message for the king. A solitary man with a lame right hand couldn't be much of a threat to a powerful king, and perhaps the despised Jew really did have a word from his God. Eglon may have felt proud that the God of Israel had a message for him, and the message was definitely delivered. And since he was no doubt afraid not to listen to it, he dismissed his guards and attendants and gave Ehud a personal interview in his private chambers. Since Ehud had to kill Eglon in a way that was quick and quiet and that would catch the king by surprise, he made use of his what was considered a disability. Ehud made a very sharp dagger, hid it under his clothing on his right side, and even if the guards frisked him, they most likely would not have examined his right side, but only his left side of his body, because that's where most men carried their weapons. Verse 31, after Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. Well, Shamgar, unfortunately, only gets one sentence. That's it. The guy kills 600 men with a stick, and he only gets one sentence. Now, the stick was called what? It's called an ox goad. And the reason they called it an ox goad was what? They goad the ox with it. So that's why it's called an ox goad. Now, I looked up pictures of an ox goad. Apparently, we're not real sure. Some of them are just a wooden stick, and that's it, like a staff. Some of them is a wooden stick, and it has a metal pointy thing on the end so you can poke the ox and make them go forward. And some of them have a metal pointy thing on the end and a little hook, so you can hook them, I guess. I've never tried to go to Knox, but apparently that's how they do it. But it was a stick, and it may have been a stick with a metal thing on the end, which would have made a pretty good weapon. But he struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Now, that's impressive, but why do we not find that more impressive than we do? Do what? He only got one sentence because somebody else killed 1,000 people with a donkey's jaw. And I guess 1,000 people with a donkey's jaw is more interesting to us than 600 people with an ox goad. So he's up against Samson here for fame, and Ehud just kind of, forgive the term, got the short end of the stick. So, so only one verse is devoted to Shamgar, and it isn't even stated that he was a judge. Judges chapter 5, verse 6 indicates that he was a contemporary with Deborah and Barak. Son of Anath may mean that he was from the town of Beth Anath in Naphtali, which was also the tribe Barak came from. Since Anath was the name of a Canaanite goddess of war, perhaps son of Anath was a nickname that meant son of battle. That is, he was a mighty warrior. What was significant about Shamgar was the weapon that he used. It was the closest thing that Shamgar could find to a spear because the enemy had confiscated the weapons of the Israelites. We find that in chapter 5, verse 8. We'll see that, I believe, next week. So they didn't have their regular weapons, and so he made this weapon. He didn't make this weapon. He used this ox goad that he already had as a weapon. So here was a man who obeyed God and defeated the enemy, even though his resources were limited. Instead of complaining about not possessing a sword or a spear, Shamgar gave what he had to the Lord, and the Lord used it. Joseph Parker said, "What is a feeble instrument in the hands of one man is a mighty instrument in the hands of another, simply because of the spirit of that other burns with holy determination to accomplish the work that has to be done." That was the case with Shamgar, as it was with Samson. They used whatever they had, and God did the rest. All right, any comments about chapter 3? All right, we're building here. Now, Judges chapter 4 is a fascinating story, even more lengthy, about a particular judge that you may know better. After Ehud died, verse 1 says, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, a king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. And by the way, I pronounced it when I was young, all my life, Hazor, until I went to Israel the first time in 1987. There has been extensive archaeological digs done in Hatzor, and that was when my professors and the locals taught me that it's pronounced Hatzor, not Hazor. And so if you go to Israel today, they'll say the word Hatzor. And so I'm going to pronounce it Hatzor because I am probably mispronouncing every other name in this chapter, and so I want to get one of them right. Hatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim, because he had 900 iron chariots and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried to the Lord for help. So here, it's not 18 or 18, now it's up to 20. Now, Warren Wiersbe gives us a list of the characters in this drama as follows. If this were going to be a movie or a full book, these are the characters in the movie. Jabin was the king of Hatzor in Canaan. He was a tyrant. Jabin was the bad guy. Deborah was a Jewish judge, a woman of faith and courage. Barak was a reluctant Jewish general. And so you have Deborah and Barak, and I'm using it Barak. I'm pronouncing it Barak instead of Barak. It probably was Barak. But those are the good people, Deborah and Barak. Sisera was also the bad guy. He was the captain of Jabin's army. Heber was a Canaanite neighbor at peace with Jabin. Jael was the wife of Heber, handy with a hammer. And we'll get to that in a minute. And then there is Jehovah God, who is in charge of wars and weather in this narrative. All right, verse 4. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah, and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. Now, this is interesting because they don't seem to have a formal government here. There are no politicians, amen? There's nobody running for office. And so how it worked out, I don't know, I can't say, but she is the judge. And she obviously had demonstrated herself as someone who was wise and God was with her. And everybody seemed to acknowledge it. She had no opposition among the people. And so anytime they had disputes, they went to her, sitting under her tree, and she held court. And so she was just by default the leader of the nation. Verse 6, she sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands. So she, upon the direction of God, contacts this leader and says, I've got good news. God is going to give us victory over the enemy. And he's going to use you to do it. But he's given me the plan. So I'm going to give you the plan. You go carry it out. Okay. Now she does tell him she's going to play a small part. She's going to send for this guy and lure him out. And then she says, you and the guy's clobbering. Verse 8, Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. Now let me ask you this. Why do you think he said that? He says to her, okay, if you're with me, I'll do it. If you're not with me, it's not going to happen. Yeah, she's the lucky charm. She's the only thing that he has between him and God. I really think he sees that. And I think he wants to confirm her sincerity when she says to him, apparently, that God told her to tell him. And so he wants her there. He'll do it, but he doesn't want to do it alone. Verse 9, very well, Deborah said, I will go with you, but because of the way you're going about this, like a big chicken, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman. Now, we assume in this verse that the woman is a reference to who? To Deborah. No, she's actually speaking literally here, being put in the hands of a woman, and gets a spike through his head. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But she says to him, you won't get the honor for the kill. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, where, verse 10, where he summoned Zebulun and Naphtali. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. Now, Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree of Zananim near Kadesh. I wish I had a picture of the great tree. It's called the great tree. It must have been a great tree. Verse 12, when they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera gathered together, Sisera's the bad guy, gathered together his 900 iron chariots and all the men with him from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River. Then Deborah said to Barak, go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you So Barak went down to Mount Tabor, followed by 10,000 men. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all of his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth, Hagoyim, and all the troops of Sisera fell by the sword, not a man was left. Now, I believe we're going to find out in the next chapter, in chapter 5, that it was rainy season and the chariots would get all bogged down in the mud. So normally they're a huge advantage, not so much in the mud, because they didn't know how to do mud tires yet. And so they got bogged down. Even Sisera himself abandoned his chariot. God had raised up a courageous woman named Deborah. By the way, in Hebrew, the word Deborah means bee, like a little bee. I don't know why that's important. Maybe it's not, but that's what it means. To be the judge in the land. This was an act of grace, but it was also an act of humiliation for the Jews. For at the time, they lived in a male-dominated society that wanted only mature male leadership. They didn't typically have women leaders. As Isaiah chapter 3, verse 12 says, as for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. That is, for a woman to rule over a nation was an embarrassment to the nation. But it does tell me that the men didn't step up to the plate, and so God used her. For God to give his people a woman judge was to treat them like little children, which is exactly what they were when it came to spiritual things. Deborah was both a judge and a prophetess, which is interesting, by the way. There's a great biblical precedent for women prophetesses, which is the only kind of prophetess there is, but for women who were prophets in the Bible. Miriam, the sister of Moses, was a prophetess in Exodus chapter 15, and later biblical history introduces us to Huldah in 2 Kings, also a prophetess, Noadiah in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 14, Anna in Luke chapter 2, if you remember that, part of the Christmas story. And the 4 daughters of Philip were also prophetesses in Acts chapter 21. God called Deborah a prophetess and a judge, but she saw herself as a mother to her people. I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. That's Judges chapter 5, verse 7. The wayward Jews were her children, and she welcomed them and counseled them. So God revealed to Deborah that Barak, which, by the way, means lightning, was to assemble and lead the Israelite army and draw Sisera's troops into a trap near Mount Tabor, or Mount Tabor, and there the Lord would defeat them. So that's what happened. Everybody, chariots or not, they were all routed. Everybody's killed. There's one left. Who is it? Sisera. He jumped off the chariot and took off running. Verse 17. Sisera, however, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there were friendly relations between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the clan of Heber the Kenite. So Jael went in to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she put a covering over him. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him up, which is fascinating because if you're thirsty, you've been running a long time, you've been in battle, he's going to be thirsty, and she gives him what instead? Gives him milk. Well, I like milk too, but not when I'm parched. Maybe it made him sleepy, I don't know. Verse 20, "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If somebody comes by and asks you, 'Is anybody here?' say no." In other words, he wanted her to do what? Lie. He wanted her to lie for him. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and the most obvious clause in the Bible, and he died. Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. Now again, I don't write these, I just read them. It's a fascinating story, is it not? Now, why would all of this unfold like this? Well, since Sisera knew that Heber and his people were friendly toward Jabin, the settlement seemed a good place to stop and rest. When Heber's wife, Jael, came out to meet Sisera and invite him into her tent, the Canaanite captain was sure that he was at last safe. After all, in that culture, nobody would dare enter a wife's tent except her husband. So Jael gave him milk instead of water and then covered him with a blanket, and he was confident that he had found a dependable ally and could rest in peace. But Sisera made the mistake of telling Jael to lie if anybody asked whether he was there. Being a wise woman, she concluded that Sisera was fleeing the battlefield, which meant that the Jews had won the battle and the Canaanite grip on the land was broken. Now, if she figured that out, and she probably did, she's a pretty smart lady, because he's the only one left. If he wasn't the only one left and he was doing well in battle, he wouldn't be running like that. He wouldn't be hiding in her tent and asking her to lie for him. So she did the math, figured it out, that he's on the losing side. And so if she protected Sisera, she'd be in trouble with the Jews, her own relatives. No doubt somebody was chasing Sisera, and whoever it was wouldn't be satisfied until the captain was dead. So when Sisera was in a deep sleep, Jael killed him by pounding a tent peg through his head. In the eastern nomadic tribes, it was the women who put up and took down the tents. So ladies, you knew how to use a hammer and a spike. And she certainly used that talent, or put that talent to good use. So she knew how to use that hammer. When Barak arrived on the scene, he discovered that his enemy was dead and that Deborah's prediction had been fulfilled. For a captain to flee from a battle was embarrassing. For a captain, for him to be killed while fleeing was humiliating, but to be killed by a woman was the most disgraceful thing you could have happen to you as a captain. How about that? Verse 23, on that day God subdued Jabin, the Canaanite king, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, the Canaanite king, until they destroyed him. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. That statement could have been made by a space alien in a science fiction movie, but it wasn't. The Apostle Paul wrote these words to the believers in Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, reminding them of a principle every Christian needs to take to heart. When God goes to war, he usually chooses the most unlikely soldiers, hands them the most unusual weapons, and accomplishes through them the most unpredictable results. For example, God gave Shagmar an ox goad, and with it he killed 600 men. Jael used a hammer and a tent peg to kill this captain, and Gideon, as we'll see next time or in the next few weeks, routed the whole Midianite army with only pitchers and torches as weapons. Samson slaughtered 1,000 Philistines using only the jawbone of a donkey. And young David killed the giant Goliath with a stone hurled from a shepherd's sling. West Point isn't likely to offer courses on how to use these weapons. It simply is God doing what God does, taking whatever is available around us in our life for his glory. And so if you're sitting out there tonight thinking that you don't have any talent, you don't have any ability, God doesn't care. He will use whatever you have in your life for his glory if you'll be obedient to him. That's really the lesson. That's the lesson of a tent peg. Something as insignificant as a tent peg. So the women didn't carry weapons. Even if they had them in the tent, the women wouldn't have access to them. Generally, it would be their husbands. But she had a hammer and a tent peg, and she sure used it. I don't know if you have a hammer and a tent peg, ladies, but God will use whatever you have. And he may shock you with what he's able to do with whatever we have in our life. All right, any questions about that chapter? Or either chapter, 3 and 4?
Notice that the time periods keep getting longer and longer. The time that they are in bondage and then the time that they have peace, they keep getting longer. Does that continue?
Well, we're going to see that. It does vary. It's not the same. The only time that I remember that it's the same is the first 2 times. But, and again, I always say this is an absurd statement to make, but if I were God, I would have let them go about 200 years, to change their attitude. Remember, down in Egypt, it took 400 years before, and even then, they were difficult. So, yeah, it is interesting. We'll see that continue, though. All right, anybody else? Yes, Greg. Uh-huh. And a tent peg? Yeah, you should run as fast as you can. Yeah, I grew up camping with my family, and we always had this saying, never trust a woman in a tent. So, from this passage, I don't know. Yeah, so anyway, it's a fascinating story. Just it's something you remember, definitely. All right, any other questions? All right, that concludes our Bible study for tonight. We're going to look at our prayer sheet right now. If you would take that out.